Sleeping in Emma's cottage was comfortable, like being inside an egg. The house was tiny, just 2 rooms up and 2 down, part of the long barn building. Cosmo's bedroom looked out onto a little cobbled yard at the side, where Mrs. Tidings grew pinks, lavender, sage, and a camellia bush round the edges. Besides pots of geraniums and begonias, he could hear the comfortable quacking of her ducks in the shed across the yard. From his other window, in the back wall, he could see the water meadow and the fold of wood curving round the river. There was a trellised wallpaper on the wall with bunches of roses, a picture of King George V wearing the Order of the Garter, and a soulful little girl looking up at a thrush. Just the same, it took a long time to get back to sleep. Next morning, Mr. Marvel was brought in to inspect the fallen wardrobe. "You don't hardly know what to make of a thing like that, do you?" he said, after surveying it for some time in silence. He did not offer any suggestions as to what might have caused it to shift 12 feet from its base and fall on Cosmo, but added thoughtfully, "If you want her put back where she was before, Mrs. Doom, I could get a couple of maintenance men down from the place, I dare say, to help me do that." "I think we'd rather get rid of it. What do you feel, Cosmo? You'd have a lot more space in your room without it. If you ever wanted to put up a model railway or anything of the kind." Cosmo didn't think he would be wanting model railways, but he was happy at the suggestion of his permanent residence at the mill house that Eunice's words seemed to hold, and he was perfectly definite in his feelings about the wardrobe. "I'd sooner get rid of it, thank you." Can't say I blame you. Well, Mr. Marvel, can it be got out?" Mr. Marvel measured it with his eye. "Not in one piece," he said. "That must have been put together in here. Beautiful oak. Cut up a treat, that will. You make yourself a nice dresser You could make yourself a nice dresser or a half a dozen coffee tables." "Oh, well, we'll think of something." "Maybe there's a skeleton in it," Cosmo said hopefully. It still gave him a very queer feeling to see the massive piece of furniture leaning drunkenly against the end of his bed. There must have been an earthquake. How otherwise could it have got there? Slightly to his disappointment, he was not encouraged to help with the dismantling of the wardrobe. "Just indulge me in this, will you, Cosmo?" Eunice said. "I can't avoid a nervous feeling that it might fall on you again when it was being taken to pieces, or that you'd get your leg accidentally sawn off, or some other little mischance. I have to go into Oxford to leave my proofs at my publisher's. Would you like to come along? I don't have to see my editor till 2. We could do some sightseeing in the morning and have lunch out." So the morning was spent cheerfully in looking at college gardens and going up to the Radcliffe Camera and Magdalen Tower, followed by lunch at the Mitre. While Eunice was visiting her editor, Cosmo went into Blackwell's bookshop, and there he was surprised to run into the pale, self-contained Moley, also browsing among paperbacks. "Hello," Cosmo said, unguardedly, forgetting the feud in his surprise. "What are you doing in Oxford?" "Hello yourself." Moley did not sound particularly hostile, quite amicable, in fact. "Why shouldn't I be here? I live in Oxford." "Well then, if you live here, why in the world are you a boarder?" Moley said calmly, "I'm a boarder because I like it better." "You'd rather board than live at home?" Cosmo was thunderstruck. "Dear me, yes," Moley drawled. "You see, my parents are divorced. I don't greatly care for my stepmamma, who lives here in Oxford with my dad, let alone my dear, sweet, angelic little stepbrother and stepsister. Also, I'm supposed to have a wonky ticker, you know." He thumped his skinny chest. "And old Doc Hobson said there would be less general wear and tear if I were residing at school, under controlled conditions, you know. Conditions at my father's house are sometimes a bit uncontrolled." Cosmo hardly knew what to say. He was greatly startled at the new light on Moley's home life, and felt sympathetic too. After a moment he asked, "What about your mother? Where is she?" "Oh, well, she's an actress, you see." Lalage Bodgeworth, even Cosmo, coming from far away, knew that name. "So she's mostly off somewhere making a film or in a play. But if she's working in London, where she has a house, I go and stay with her there in the holidays." At this moment, Eunice came into the bookshop, accompanied by a thin, worried, grey-haired man. "Oh, there's my Da," Moley said. "He's not a bad old stick, actually, but my stepmamma has him trussed trephined and hogtied, unfortunately. There you are, Paul. Moley's father gave him a harassed, affectionate look. Professor Doom and I have to go back to her home to look through some extra material, and we think might have to go into a book. Do you want to catch a bus home, or... He glanced from his son to Cosmo to Eunice. Do you want to come along? Professor Doom has kindly suggested it. Do come, Paul, if you like, Eunice said. It would be fine for Cosmo to have some company. This invitation made Cosmo very nervous. Would Moley think that pressure was being put on him to visit the farm pariah? Did he himself want Moley to come? Moley appeared rather hesitant, but perhaps the mill seemed preferable to his stepbrother and stepsister. After a moment's thought, he said, Thanks, I'd like to come. It was decided that Moley should drive out with Cosmo and Eunice, while Professor Molesworth went back to his office to get a spare set of Eunice's proofs. On the drive out, Eunice was unexpectedly funny, describing for Moley's benefit how, in the days when she had been teaching at the school, she had taken a party of advanced A-level math students on a working holiday, staying at a ruined Scotch castle, which had turned out to be the storage place of an illicit whiskey still. Her students had become involved with the risky runners. I began to wonder why their maths was getting better and better, but also wilder and wilder. They seemed to be grasping concepts I'd have thought that were far out of their reach. And then I went out to dinner with the local laird and his family, and when I got back, the students and the whiskey runners were having a great party, playing sardines all over the castle and hunting in the dungeons for the square root of -1, which somebody swore he had seen down there. Moley laughed uninhibitedly. Were there any ghosts in the castle? No, none, but we think we have acquired a poltergeist at Curtis's mill house, don't we, Cosmo? Eunice told the story of the wardrobe. Cosmo, anxiously watching Moley's expression while she told it, wondered if Moley would suspect this to be yet another piece of family boasting or exaggeration. He wished that Eunice had not mentioned the wardrobe, but Moley seemed sincerely interested and astonished. Cosmo could not help worrying, too, slightly, about Moley's weak heart. Suppose some other piece of furniture fell over while he was at the mill house. They had better stay out of doors as much as possible. Although sad, it was also something of a relief that Con and Sim had gone. Supposing Moley would have been able to see them, but very likely he would not. One way and another, Cosmo felt very nervous about the visit. He wished it had not taken place. Was rather silent and constrained on the drive out, and afraid that both Eunice and Moley had noticed this. Professor Molesworth, who had a nippy little Renault, caught up with Eunice at the roundabout. She had been driving slowly, and after that both cars proceeded in consort and arrived together, the boys taking turns to open the gates. As soon as they reached the mill house, Eunice and Professor Molesworth vanished indoors to work on the book. A little half-heartedly, Cosmo began showing Moley round. They went to the island first, and looked at the weir, and Cosmo's clearing. By now, nettles and huge burdocks and teasels had grown across the mill entrance. Cosmo did not suggest going inside, and Moley did not ask to be taken in. Then they went upriver a quarter of a mile to the skiff, with Cosmo at the oars. Because rowing was one of the things forbidden to Moley, but it turned out he was knowledgeable and enthusiastic about fishing, and asked if he could come back for a day of it some time. Cosmo felt rather sad in the boat, remembering poor Sim. After a while he stopped rowing, let them drift back to the moorage, and took Moley instead to see the farm buildings and the pigs were now occupying their new quarters. Scratching the pigs' backs occupied some more time. The afternoon seemed to be dragging a bit, due to the fact that Cosmo was not certain what kind of things Moley liked doing, and Moley was being rather too polite. In the barn they found Mr. Marvel mixing pig mash. That's your wardrobe, he said, nodding to a stack of massively thick oak boards. We didn't find any skeleton in it, I dare say you'll be sorry to hear. All we found was a George III penny. You'd better have it for a luck piece. Keep it safe from anything else falling on you. He fished it from his pocket. It was dated 1765, was very thick with a grooved edge, and the head of George wearing a wreath of laurel. Somebody had bored a small hole into it. You could wear it round your neck, Mr. Marvel suggested, and threaded a piece of binder twine through the hole. This find cheered Cosmo, and he took Moley round the side of the house and showed him the lookout platform in the walnut tree. Gosh, said Moley enviously, did you make that? Gosh, what a place. I wish I could go up, but it's just the sort of thing I'm not allowed.
Oh, then you'd better not,
said Cosmo hastily, feeling that it had been rather unkind to show it to Moley. The last thing he wanted was to encourage any forbidden activity. You go up, though. Let's see you use those holds. Cosmo scurried up the pittance. He was getting expert at this by now, had worked out the most economical movements for getting from each hold to the next, and could nip round and up the big serrated trunk almost as fast as a squirrel. From the topmost piton, he had formed the habit of launching himself up with a push, gripping as he did so at the guardrail post on the left of the entrance gap for a last pull-up. But today, when he did this, to his complete and disbelieving astonishment, a section of rail simply crumbled away in his hand. He felt himself falling backwards. Down below, he heard Moley's startled yell, "Cripes! Cosmo!" Using muscles in his legs and thighs that he didn't know he had, Cosmo thrust himself sideways with his feet just before they came away from the trunk of the tree. The sideways push was just enough to allow him to get one hand over a small branch, which he gripped with frantic strength, managing to use the time of his swing past it to hook his other hand up and grasp the branch. Once dangling by both hands, he was all right. He swung his legs up over the branch and worked back to the trunk, inspected the defective guardrail, and climbed down by way of the pittance. "Wow," said Moley. "That was quite exciting. What's the matter? Have you got an enemy or something, or just suicidal tendencies?"
"I can't understand it,"
Cosmo said. Now that he was back on the ground, his knees felt as weak as milk. In fact, he was shaking like a fool.
"Mr. Marvel and I went over these posts carefully. I'd sworn that one was solid as a rock. He said they'd last 10 years.
He sure was mistaken, chum. Look at that. Moley had retrieved a bit of the piece that came away in Cosmo's hand. It was completely rotten, powdered and crumbling like sponge cake. Cosmo was struck speechless, but after a minute or two he said,
"I still don't believe it. Mr. Marvel looked at them all so carefully. So did I. None of these were rotten."
Thinking it over, he went on,
"I'd rather my cousin didn't get to hear about this, if you don't mind. She'd worry. After all, she's supposed to be in charge of me till my father gets to England."
And father would be upset if he got back and found his other son had a broken neck. "Whatever you say," Moley's tone was equable. "You'd better hide the evidence somehow."
"I'll take that rail down and ban it later."
Cosmo shivered. A light drizzle was beginning to fall. The afternoon had deteriorated.
"Come on, let's go in. It must be about tea time anyway."
In fact, Mrs. Tidings appeared in the doorway, about to ring the bell. As they walked up to it, Cosmo went across and threw his piece of rotten wood onto the log fire that smoldered in the hearth. Mrs. Tidings had cleared the big refectory table and set one of her splendid teas on it. Moley ate all her homemade delicacies with enthusiasm. "Much more than he eats at home," Professor Molesworth remarked, watching his son with a wistful eye.
"More than he eats at school,"
Cosmo said. Cosmo himself found it hard to eat. When Mrs. Tidings scolded him, he said defensively,
We had lunch out."
After tea, Eunice and the professor went back to work in her study, and it was now raining steadily. Moley and Cosmo got out a box of ivory pieces and played chess on the tea table. Cosmo was not a bad player. He played quite often with Eunice and beat her occasionally, but Moley was better, making moves with great dash and imagination. He won 4 games to Cosmo's 2.
"You ought to try playing against my cousin," Cosmo was saying. "I think you'd be pretty equally matched."
When they heard a loud crash from upstairs, followed by a series of thumps, as if one of the horses, Prince or Blossom, were walking heavily across the upstairs landing. "What the dickens?" began Moley, and Cosmo said,
"Oh, heavens, now what?"
When Mrs. Tidings, coming in with a bag of her homemade flapjacks for Moley, because he enjoyed them so much, exclaimed, "Lawks, did you ever?" She was looking past the boys at the stairs, which led down into the room where they were sitting. Cosmo spun round just in time to see his bed negotiate the turn around the banisters and come to bogganing down all by itself, apparently, the legs on their casters sliding heavily from step to step. Thumpety, thumpety, thump. Eunice and the professor, startled to death at the noise, which was like houses falling down, came dashing from the study and witnessed the bed clatter down the last 4 steps, coming to a stop still right way up on the brick floor. Even the bedclothes were still in place, though somewhat disarranged, as the mattress had slipped down against the bedhead. "Well," said Eunice. Professor Molesworth was highly suspicious. "Did you boys rig that up with a rope or something?" "No, honestly, Da, we didn't," said Moley, who was suffocating with laughter, leaning back helplessly in a chair. "Please, Professor Doom, can I come to tea every week? I've never had such a good time in my life. No wonder Cosmo isn't very keen on school if he has all these larks going on at home." Eunice gave Cosmo a sharp look and said, "You didn't pull the bed down, Cosmo. You swear you had nothing to do with it?"
"You know I didn't. I've been with you all day. You're outside with Moley."
"Yes, I know," she said. "Well, you can see," she told the Molesworths, "we have a slight case of poltergeist." "It really is remarkable," said Moley's father. He inspected the bed carefully, then went up to look at Cosmo's room from where it had traveled by itself. "For a start," he said accusingly, "it couldn't have got through the door, unless the legs had been unscrewed first." "Oh, why boggle at a little thing like that?" said Eunice. Moley began singing the Miller of D tune. "Let's spend the day at Curtis Mill, it's really jolly there, where wardrobes made of solid oak come floating through the air, and beds as well as naughty boys toboggan down the stairs." "I'm glad you're enjoying yourself," said Eunice tartly. Cosmo could see that she liked Moley, though. "But how are we going to get that bed back again? You just tell me that." "If I were you," said Professor Molesworth thoughtfully, "I wouldn't be in a hurry to put it back just yet. I'd wait till the disturbance settles down, otherwise it might well just happen again." Eunice sighed. "I dare say you're right. I can see that in the end we shall have all the furniture down here on the ground floor, or chopped to pieces outside." Cosmo's bed was put in the garden room, and Eunice told him that he had better continue to sleep in Emma's cottage till things had settled down in the mill house. "Would you consider getting an exorcist?" Professor Molesworth suggested to Eunice. She looked doubtful. "The trouble is, I don't think I'd believe in lighting candles and drawing circles on the floor, and if it doesn't convince me, why should it convince the poltergeist? No, I think we'll just have to sweat it out. I'm sorry this visit has been a bit disturbed, Norman." "Oh, don't apologize. Paul and I wouldn't have missed the experience for worlds, would we, Paul?" "It's been terrific," sighed Moley. "I haven't laughed so much since Granny locked herself in the pantry on Boxing Day." "Well, you'd better come here for a weekend sometime," Eunice said, "when things have settled down a bit." As the father and son were about to depart, Professor Molesworth, on the point of getting into the car, stopped to have a last word with Eunice about a footnote. While he did this, Moley said to Cosmo in a low voice, "I say, I know you don't want to worry your cousin with the business about your treehouse, but honestly, I should watch out if I were you." "I'm certainly going to," Cosmo said. "Thanks." "Actually," Moley said, "I didn't mention it in there in case I was speaking out of turn, but I shouldn't be surprised if that skinny old girl in back had something to do with it. Is she your grandmother? She was giving you an uncommonly old-fashioned look when we were playing chess." "Old girl in black?" Cosmo gasped at Moley. "What girl? You don't mean Mrs. Tidings?" No, the other one. The old girl in black," Moley repeated patiently. "I thought she might be your grandmother because she's a bit like you. She came swatting in with a shawl over her head when we were playing chess, and looked over your shoulder. Didn't you notice her?" he said, observing Cosmo's blank expression. "I didn't take much of a shine to her, I must say. She looked just the type to think of locking somebody up and starving them to death. Would be a real laugh riot." "No, I didn't notice her," Cosmo said, "but I'll keep a lookout. Thanks for mentioning it." And that is the end of Chapter 7.